To say that Greedfall, the latest action RPG from small French developer Spiders, is a mixed bag would be an understatement. For everything that I find interesting or fun about Greedfall, there's a handful of niggling little issues or quirks that leave me feeling less than enthusiastic about it as a whole. Greedfall takes place on a newly discovered island paradise known as Tier D, where 3 distinct nations vie for control of the territory amongst themselves and the native islanders. Players take the role of Desarde, an ambassador for one of the 3 nations on the island, as they explore the new world in search of a cure for a mysterious illness ailing civilization back in the motherland. For the most part, Greedfall has some interesting lore and world building on offer, but the actual narrative suffers from some clumsy writing and pacing issues. Most interactions between characters drag on, and I'd often find myself skipping through while speed reading the subtitles just to get to the point. Meanwhile, the game throws so many side quests at you from the word go that it feels like the main narrative doesn't really kick into gear until hours and hours have gone by. I'm sure if you focus on the main quests, this isn't so bad, but even then there's no great narrative thrust to keep you pushing forward until about halfway through. I do feel like I have to reiterate though that the game does have some really neat lore on offer, such as a culture of seafarers that make trade and navigation deals in return for unborn children, and more often than not this is what drove me to pursue Greedfall's deluge of early side quests instead of its main plot. With that said, it also relies on some more awkward tropes from time to time, such as magical natives and the whole colonialist chosen one thing, but to the game's credit it does try to subvert these cliches at least a little. I feel like overall I would be a bit more invested in Greedfall's narrative if it was delivered in a compelling way, but the constant interactions between characters aren't exactly exciting, mostly due to the aforementioned clumsy writing, but this isn't helped along by the game's voice work, which is pretty average if I'm being honest. That's not to say that there aren't some standouts in that department, but for a game that features conversations so prominently, this element just isn't as enjoyable as you might hope. It also doesn't help that your companions endlessly bark their catchphrases every time they enter battle, of which they only have 1, maybe 2 lines if you're lucky. It quickly gets old. Similarly, the game looks fine, but its visuals aren't really anything to write home about. You'll find yourself in a number of wilderness and urban environments that all sort of blend together after a while. I mean, once you've seen one section of forest, you've seen them all, right? But there is a nice variety to be found in terms of some of the monster designs. You're gonna spend most of your time fighting bear things, wolf things, and samey looking bandits 90% of the time, but sometimes Greedfall will throw a cool boss fight at you that, while definitely sharing a distinct style, all look pretty unique to some degree. While we're still on the subject of visuals, Greedfall runs fairly well on the PS4 Pro, though constant texture pop-in and obstructive camera angles during conversations were regular occurrences to say the least, and they were distracting. On the gameplay side of things, Greedfall does manage to throw some unique ideas into the standard action RPG mix, but it's hard to say that it really stands out overall. The game lets you approach most scenarios in a number of ways depending on your skills, and while I always appreciate a game that lets me take a non-lethal approach to progression, Greedfall's RPG systems just end up feeling pretty restrictive. Basically, you're given a number of talents such as intuition, charisma, vigor, and crafting that you can allocate points to at certain levels, and these unlock different elements of the game. Having a higher charisma will give you a better chance of smooth talking your way out of trouble, while having more vigor will allow you to use balance beams, jump over gaps, or scramble up walls, for instance. In theory, this is a fantastic idea, and most quests and locations are built with multiple solutions in mind, so that no matter what skills you have, you'll never hit a roadblock. With that said, I often found myself resorting to the most basic approach, such as fighting, bribing with my money, or wasting my time searching for an item because the skill requirements are usually pretty high, and you only get talent points once every few levels. There's an entire crafting and customization system for your gear that I never got a good look at because I simply didn't allocate any points to the crafting skill. Even if you don't do the dumb thing that I did where you spread your talents out so you can try as many approaches as possible, you're still bound to be locked into 1 or 2 different skills, which the game does a poor job of explaining until after you find these locked paths. Now, combat is certainly going to be the most common path you'll go down, and for the most part, Greedfall's combat is fine, if a little bit repetitive. It does implement this neat system where you're encouraged to break an enemy's armor with a secondary weapon before attacking their core health with your primary weapon, while also unbalancing your foes by using parries and heavy attacks so that you can deal more damage to them when they're knocked to the ground. It's a cool concept to be sure, but I found most fights devolved into dodging around enemies to stab them and build up my fury meter before spamming powerful armor-ignoring fury attacks. Rinse and repeat, and that's been my Greedfall combat experience for most of the game. There are of course other ways to approach a problem in Greedfall, such as stealth or conversation, and these elements are similarly fine, but aren't all that interesting. The defining feature of Greedfall's stealth is your ability to wear faction disguises to keep enemies from attacking you outright, and this is a godsend considering how clunky and awkward simply moving around the environment can be. Otherwise, the stealth mechanics are about as basic as you would imagine, often incorporating the previously mentioned talents to open up less guarded paths, like walls you can climb or cracks in a wall that you might slide through. Conversations are similarly straightforward if long-winded. Any talent you can think of that doesn't necessarily fall under a physical skill, such as charisma or insight, will open up additional dialogue options as you increase their effectiveness. You'll also get new dialogue options depending on your current party members or your standing with certain factions, and while this gives you a measure of control over where the story goes and which characters are friendly to you, this is ultimately nothing new. Really, at the end of the day, Greedfall feels like an attempt to recreate something akin to a Dragon Age or a Witcher game, and while it definitely has some unique and interesting ideas going for it, my biggest takeaway is that it falters more with the fundamentals than anything. This certainly doesn't make it a bad game, but it's definitely flawed. If nothing else though, Greedfall offers a solid amount of content. I've sunk over 20 hours into the game at this stage, and there's still a handful of side quests for me to complete, and plenty more that I haven't found, I'm sure. So if you're the type to equate value for the amount of content on offer, then Greedfall certainly has that going for it. With all that said, Greedfall is mediocre. With its interesting lore, its handful of neat ideas, and decent amount of content, Greedfall has plenty to offer, it's just that those offerings are usually janky as hell. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't get some enjoyment out of the game. It's fine, it just isn't anything really special, you know? If you're the type that likes BioWare-style RPGs and you've been itching to explore a new setting or just sink a bunch of time into a game, then you could do worse than Greedfall, though The Witcher 3 still exists, so maybe just play The Witcher 3.